So in the last lecture module, we went through that regress argument, and we saw that second option, that circular regress option, that's introduced as a possibility, but then similarly rejected because it can't possibly be the correct solution in the epistemic regress argument. And this is the way that BonJour suggests that critics often introduce and portray coherentism, and that epistemologists tend to think about coherentism. It's just that second option in the regress argument where we descend towards a foundational belief. We're making those inferential regresses, but ultimately, instead of finding a foundational belief, the regress curves back on itself, and we find it trying to justify a belief by reference to a belief that it's been trying to justify previously in the regress. And he thinks that this sort of linear model, this portrayal of how coherentism is supposed to work, really isn't accurate of any worthwhile version of coherentism. That it makes this circularity point, right, cartoonishly vivid. So on this view, right, a coherentist, say Krusty the Clown is a coherentist. You ask them, no, why do you think you're the greatest clown to ever live? Krusty would then say, well, it's because I'm the funniest man alive. And you say, well, why do you think that you're the funniest man alive? And he says, well, because people tell me so. And you say, really? Why do you suppose people tell you that you're the funniest man alive? Well, because I make them laugh. And why do you think you make them laugh? Well, because I'm the greatest clown to ever live. So BonJour wants to reject this portrayal of coherentism. And in particular, he suggests that it's precisely the way in which it suggests that all justification occurs through these linear inferences, where one belief is justified by another belief, is justified by another belief, and so on. Ultimately, he thinks coherentists don't believe this. And so if we look at a more contemporary coherentist theorist, say someone like Willard Van Orrin Quine, who articulates a coherentist theory of justification in the web of belief, BonJour would say a more realistic picture of contemporary coherentist theorists like Quine would work something more as follows. They reject this foundationalist notion that there are basic beliefs, that there are beliefs that are unrevisable. And in fact, Quine does. He rejects the idea that even logical beliefs are unrevisable. And so justification can't be this linear chain working its way back to these foundational beliefs. They reject that ending point, and they also reject then the methodology that would lead them there. And so how should we understand justification then? Well, on their view, the justification of any belief within that system is a function of how well the belief coheres with the rest of the system. It's the overall relationships within the belief system that are supposed to justify any individual belief that is part of that system. And this, in fact, is really the sort of structure that we see with Quine. Now, Quine has a specific addition to this. His view doesn't reject the notion that we're more or less committed to particular beliefs, or that some beliefs aren't better events than other beliefs. He doesn't hold that view. And in fact, I don't know of any coherentist that actually holds that view. Instead, Quine allows that parts of our system have greater degrees of incorrigibility than other parts. That is, some of our beliefs are much more central and less subject to revision, more highly events than other parts of our belief systems. And so when we think about how people make revisions in their belief systems, Quine suggests, well, the way people make revisions in their belief system is the same way that scientists revise their theories in light of anomalous data. They don't get a bit of anomalous data and then reject the central relationships in their theoretical models. They don't just go, that's it then, no problem. No, instead what they do, Quine thinks, is they tinker around the edges, right? They look for explanations of why the data isn't as predicted that don't impugn that core or central idea. And Quine thinks that the more central a belief is in our system, the more closer it is to the core, the less revisable it is. That doesn't mean that that's an arbitrary distinction, it's in part because of its centrality to the whole belief system, how important it is for the integrity of the system as a whole, and also how well evinced it is as well. And so those core beliefs are somewhat resistant to revision. They're the ones that we would least like to revise in light of difficulties. As we move out to the fringes, however, those beliefs are less well evinced. They're less crucial to the overall integrity of the system and hence can be revised with less impact on the system. And so they are more revisable. And so there's this differential role that they play. Of course, once we start to think about that, we realize that a contemporary foundationalist, who's what BonJour calls a weak foundationalist, and a coherentist like Quine, they look pretty close to each other. When we thought these two views were mutually exclusive, it turns out, right, that as you move more towards a weak foundationalism and more towards a differentiable coherentism, those views start to merge into each other in a way that doesn't make them mutually exclusive to one another. Now, for BonJour, the important thing that we should take away from the regress argument is that coherentists reject the linear model of justification. They don't reject it completely. Quine doesn't reject it completely. He doesn't reject it completely. Instead, inferential justification only appears if one considers, BonJour says, attempts to justify a belief or a small set of beliefs in isolation. So that first step, when you ask Krusty why he believes he's the greatest clown to ever live, at that point, it's appropriate for Krusty to cite other beliefs and make an inference. Why do you believe this? Here are my reasons. Yeah, but why do you believe those? Here are my reasons. But BonJour says, once we start to move away from these isolated cases, these just give me some reasons for what you believe cases, and more towards a more systematic question, the sort of thing that you would get as the regress progresses, he thinks then the modality of justification changes. The way in which we approach justification is no longer this linear progression, is no longer by appealing to other beliefs in the system, other beliefs in the system, and then other beliefs in the system, and so on. Instead, he thinks the issue of such an infinite regress never arises, since at a certain point, we're starting to call not the isolated beliefs into question, but the system and its overall integrity into question. And it's at this point, BonJour thinks, that we switch from a regress or a linear model of justification into evaluating the overall coherence or global justification of the system. And so he thinks at this level, the question isn't one of linear support between individual beliefs, but one of mutual or reciprocal support, overall coherence. And he thinks without this linearity of justification in all cases and its implied prioritization, he thinks, then the issue of regresses never emerge. It's not a mechanism that is supposed to be employed endlessly, he thinks. At a certain point, when we have a sufficient skeptical scope in our belief systems, the system itself is the thing that's being called into question and being analyzed and or cited as the source of justification for the view overall. And so for him, you could ask somebody to justify isolated beliefs in their belief system. I don't know, say someone is religious, and you say, well, why do you believe in the tripartite division of the Trinity? And they would say, well, I believe that because of this and this. And then, but as you continue to question them, and as you call more and more of their beliefs into question, right, then you start to question their entire worldview, that entire religious belief system, and not just some isolated belief. As that call for justification increases in its scope, right, then BonJour thinks we start to switch from this linear inferential based justification model and move more towards a model that draws on the overall properties of the belief system as a whole.